The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 2nd and 3rd chapter. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of the human being is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So back there at the table is my son Jude. Everybody say hi to Jude.
Hey, Jude.
Hey, Jude. I will say, we considered naming him Lennon, because I love the Beatles. And it was Lennon, but I didn't want a Lenny in my life. No offense if you're Lenny. We just didn't want a Lenny. So we decided to go with Jude, so that we got both our biblical reference as well as our Beatles reference at the same time. But the downside was, in Denmark, when I traveled to Denmark and I told this story, the name of Judas in their Bible
Is Lenny.
is Jude. So they're like, "Why did you name your son Jude?" In English, it's different. I've been teaching Jude how to drive. And for those of you who have taught someone to drive, it's been a real challenge, not to Jude, but to me. And not because Jude is hard to teach, but because there's so many things that you sort of take for granted as you drive. You sort of forget about that. You kind of do it by rote. You do it because you've always done it. You don't really think about it. You just kind of drive, right? And so then when you're trying to explain this to somebody, and you've given them rules to follow. Never drive on the left side of the road, right? You shouldn't drive on the left side of the road, right? Right. Well, how do you turn into a right side parking space? Right? Suddenly you're like, wait, you're not allowed to do that. So how do I get over there? Well, you have to but you just told me not to do this. Or, when you get to a place when you're like, all right, so you have to drive the speed limit. Everywhere you go, drive the speed limit. Because it's not just the speed limit, it's the recommended speed. And if you drive too slow, you become an impediment to other people. It becomes a problem. So drive the speed limit, right? Just drive the speed limit. And then you get on 470, and everybody's going 90, and you're driving the speed limit, and suddenly you're the impediment. So, except when everybody else is driving too fast. Right? But you just told me that you have to drive the speed limit. Do you see how that is? But when we think of rules, we think, yeah, rules are important. We put rules in place. We have rules for a reason. We keep the rules, except when they don't. Except when rules are squishy. Except when we need to have maybe a different rule, or in that moment, we have to do something differently. Are you following me? Our text today is sort of like that. It's sort of that thing. It's all about Jesus. Now, what I love about the Christ, when Christ enters into the universe again, it's like Jesus is serving as a giant reminder to us, not of the rules, but the why. Why do we do what we do? It's about setting before us not a pattern, not a way of life that consists of rules, but it consists of purpose. That we're called to live by purpose, and that we're called to live in a particular way because it's the purpose that is given into us. I mean, Jesus puts it really simple in our text today. Jesus says, okay, so on the Sabbath, do you do good things or do you do bad things? Do you feed or do you kill? And what do they respond? They stay silent. Because, I'll just tell you this, because it's a lot easier just to give rules. It's a simple thing to give rules and say, always do things this way, because I can say it and then we do it. But then what happens is as soon as you give that rule, then you suddenly realize, wait, that rule can't work in every situation. Now, why do we have rules? Why are there rules? Why? And this is actually not a rhetorical question. I'm curious, why do you think we have rules? Good order, what? To prevent chaos. Safety. I mean, there's a good reason for rules, right? I mean, there's a purpose for rules in our life. We can't just let anybody do whatever they want willy-nilly in the universe, right? But those rules can't be the purpose and the why we do things. What they end up being is sort of like a guideline, a guide to help us move our way forward until they hit the thing that they're no longer moving us towards that purpose. They're pushing us into something that's not intended to be. So if somebody comes in and talked about a man with a withered hand, I kind of get that. I've got a bum finger. I'm going to have that for the rest of my life. It's very stiff. When he said, stretch out your hand, I'm like, I really wish my hand would stretch out. But can you imagine if you've had a chronic thing where your hand, I can imagine this might be somebody with a palsy, it's maybe cerebral palsy, maybe have lived their whole life curled in and hurt. And then he said, now, what is the right thing for me to do? To say to this man, I'm sorry, you're out of luck. It's the Sabbath. And God would be angry if we healed you on the Sabbath. Or do we extend life? Do we return to our purpose? Do we return to the reason why we do these things? And it says, stretch out your hand. So why Sabbath? So there's got to be a why to Sabbath. There's a reason why we have Sabbath. And there's a reason why the Sabbath was implemented. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And it connects to our whole theme, which is about reconnection. You and I are really good at distractions. Wouldn't you say? We're really good at distracting ourselves. And it's getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. It's getting to the point, like in my household, if we're playing a board game, and we play some pretty games that move pretty fast. We play a game called Dominion, where you kind of like pick cards up and you kind of put them down quickly. Like it'll be like 8 seconds between turns, but my kids can't manage to sit there for 8 seconds. They've got to look at their phone and see that somebody said, hey, look at me, right? They can't stay focused. We're really good at distractions. And I would say that we're even further better at escape. That we look for means of escape. And we try to escape the places that we're in, rather than learning to live into and deal with and find our come back to that sense of purpose, come back to that sense of why, of coming into our hearts and saying, what are we doing here and why are we doing this? We lose that thing. Instead, we want to escape from the hard things. We want to escape from them. And we're actually called to return to them. See, the reason I think that God said, you need Sabbath, is that God was saying, people, y'all gotta chill. You get yourself so wound up with being busy and being productive and moving from thing to thing to thing. You are filling your life with stuff and more stuff. We are killing our kids and their calendars right now. We are filling them with thing after thing, thinking that the more we give them to do, the happier they are, when what we're finding is the exact opposite of true is true. That the more we pack our kids full of things, the less happy they are. God knows that you and I are actually designed to stop, to rest. But let me be clear. I don't mean rest as in like, ugh. We tend to think of Sabbath as the day we go, oh, thank God. And we think of Sabbath as like, stop doing things. And that's what it turned into, the rule. Stop doing things. Don't pluck grains. Don't heal. Don't build bricks. Don't do these things. We turned it into rules when the purpose was to say, you have permission to slow down. And not only slow down, but to use that moment, to use this to reconnect to your purpose. And God, is going to help you find and discover that purpose. Reconnection in Sabbath is not about you stopping. It's actually about you uncentering yourself and rediscovering your center in Christ. Rediscovering where God is wanting to say to you in this moment. Rediscovering that, I've been so busy going on with this that I haven't actually stopped and said, Lord, what are you calling me to do, be, and feel in this moment? Well, how am I actually called to live and exist in this moment? How do I get rid of all the crowd of noises and phones and newspapers and news and radio and podcasts? How do I set all that down and go, Christ, come speak to me. What am I called to do? Who am I called to be? And it's a recentering of Christ in our life rather than decentering ourselves. Are you following me so far? Are you with me so far? So Sabbath, the whole idea of Sabbath is not you stop doing things. It's for you to start letting go of things so that you can actually hear the voice of God active in your life again. Because the purpose of life is life.
Amen.
The purpose of life is love. The purpose of life is to heal and be healed. The purpose of life is if you're hungry for the love of God, eat. Right? The purpose of life is to see people who are hungry and give them something to eat. The purpose of life is to extend ourselves with love and life into the others. How dare we attempt to go before somebody who's hurting and struggling and say, I would help you, but it's Saturday. Do you think God's like, thank God, somebody's doing it right? I have this thing that they know that I do on staff sometimes. If you want to know what Jesus really, really thinks about something, pretend like Jesus is saying it from the cross. So it would look like this. They better not feed anybody on a Saturday. Does that make sense? Can you imagine the voice of Christ speaking that on a cross? I hope that man doesn't get healed because it's Saturday. Of course not. Because the purpose of life is life and to extend into life. And I would say Jesus is far more connected to the Sabbath because he's living out that purpose of life and recentering into what God is calling him to do on the Sabbath, which is to eat and to heal, that he's more centered in the Christ than everybody else is because they're still centered on themselves and what they're doing. Are you following? They're still so much into like, you got this, you got that, you can't this, you can't that, you got to make sure you... So Sabbath is not rest. Sabbath is decentering. Sabbath is not putting things down. It's actually picking up the work of figuring out and living into our purpose. It's why we worship on the Sabbath. The Christian Sabbath is on Sundays. The Christian Sabbath, because we worship on the day that Christ was raised, which is the day after the Sabbath. So we call it the Christian Sabbath. But the reason we worship on that day is because that's our opportunity to reconnect, reground, recenter, refocus, and rediscover our way. And hopefully, my hope is that when you leave places like this, after worship, you're going like, okay, all right, I'm recentered. I'm recentered on God, and I'm letting God be my axis and let me be the orbit, rather than putting myself as the axis and letting God try to figure God's way in. Sabbath is critical, and there's so many ways to do Sabbath. There's so many ways. Some of you, I know, go for walks on a Sabbath. Some of you spend time with family. That's your Sabbath. Some of you like to read or to rest. Here's what I want to challenge you to do, though, this week. I want you to ask yourself, is my Sabbath recentering myself onto what God is calling me to do and be so that I'm living out the purpose that God has placed inside me to live love and life? Or am I escaping my busyness? Am I just kind of setting things down so not thinking about it for a minute? Because guess what happens on Monday? It's right back there and you're not living your purpose. You've just escaped it for a minute. How do you reconnect to the voice of God? I believe with all my heart that there is a real voice of God whispering in our ears all the time. It's telling us, it's speaking to us, it's saying, love, care, help, life, good. If we use our Sabbath to recenter, reground, hold that, let that pull us into our Mondays, into our Tuesdays, and then come back next week. Recenter again. When that wobble happens, when our axis is off, recenter again and rediscover the purpose that God and Christ have in you. For Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. And that is what we should wake up with every day. If you'll pray. Lord God, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, on paths as yet untrodden through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out in good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us, your love supporting us. In the name of love, his name is Jesus.